Momentum is building for Ukraine's counterattack. The war in Eastern Europe continues at full speed in the south and east directions. Clashes are intensifying in Bakhmut, the last stronghold of the eastern front line. In addition, Ukraine's intensifications of its attacks near the Crimean peninsula and the Kremlin makes Vladimir Putin very uneasy. According to Ukrainian officials, the reason for the intensifying clashes in Bakhmut is Russia's effort to seize the city on May the 9th, when the Victory Day is celebrated. While the Russian forces tried to occupy Bakhmut completely, Prigozhin's rebellion against the Kremlin, the explosions in Moscow, the Ukrainian offensive in Bakhmut, and the explosions in the Crimea stunned the Russian army. Moscow fears the precision-guided weapons could hit or run out of fuel. Elements of the Russian fleet anchored at the Sebastopol docks. Naval commanders of the Black Sea Fleet have shifted their warships from their traditional home base in the Crimea, Sebastopol, to safer waters in Russia, a top Ukrainian military intelligence officer said. Deputy Chief Major General Vadim Skibitsky announced that Russia's Naval High Command has redeployed BSF ships assigned to Sevastopol to the port of Novorossiysk on the eastern Black Sea coast, located on the east coast of the Black Sea in the Kuban region in the south of Russia. Novorossiysk is more than 350 kilometers from Ukraine. Novorossiysk is far away from the anti-ship missile launch sites and well out of range. According to Ukrainian Southern Joint Forces situation estimate, 2 Russian missile-carrying submarines left the Sevastopol base. Russian submarines joined a fleet of 11 ships in the eastern Black Sea. The Ukrainian intelligence officials' comments came after a pair of long-range attacks on fuel storage and production facilities in Crimea, which are critical to the fuel logistics supply chain. A mass drone attack on Ukraine's Taman Port fuel base hit a diesel fuel storage farm adjacent to the only bridge connecting mainland Russia to the Crimean peninsula. The Kremlin administration claimed that the Russian air defense shot down 10 to 12 kamikaze aircraft. However, 2 of the kamikaze planes reportedly crashed into fuel reservoirs and exploded, causing a massive fire covering an estimated area of 1.3 kilometers squared. Russian officials said that 188 firefighters got the fire under control. The attack appeared to have set half of the base's fuel tanks on fire and potentially destroyed hundreds of tons of diesel fuel for use in Crimea, according to open-source satellite photos released by the U.S. group Maxar. In another night attack, the Ukrainian plane struck and set fire to the buildings and fuel transport infrastructure at the Ilsc oil refinery, about 150 ft from the Taman plant in Russia's Krasnodar Oblast. State-controlled Russian news reports and social media platforms showed that smoke continued to rise from the plant. Ukrainian journalist Andrei Teslenko stated in a Friday Telegram post that the primary role of the facility is to provide fuel to Russian military units in Crimea, especially the BSF, while the Kremlin struggled with the explosions in the Crimea and Moscow. It took heavy blows on the Bakhmut front as the conflicts intensify in Bakhmut. Russia is trying to seize the city of Bakhmut by May the 9th. This effort by Russia is embodied by the sending of more Russian paratroopers to the front lines. Ukrainian forces are fighting Russian infantry Wagner paramilitary group and Russian paratroopers in Bakhmut. The seriousness of the situation on the Bakhmut front, where heavy weapons from the air and ground are used, is also evident from the intense activity of the Ukrainian army around Kiev. Artillery and missile units blew up the bridge on the chassis via Bakhmut highway. This bridge connected the only road to Bakhmut. Russian forces used this road to evacuate their wounded and to carry ammunition and additional forces. The only exit door of the Moscow troops was closed, but Russian soldiers are trying to hold on to the front lines. Russian forces are focusing their main efforts on conducting offensive operations in the Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and Marinka directions. The Ukrainian Air Force conducted 6 airstrikes targeting Russian personnel and military equipment clusters. As a result of the air raids, the Russian positions were destroyed. Ukrainian missile and artillery units also struck 5 areas where weapons and military equipment were concentrated. 3 ammunition and fuel depots and an air defense system between Bakhmut and the tank crews stationed along the front. Attention is focused on the imminent battle that has become the epicenter of the battle. The conflicts in the region were divided into 2 areas. The first area is street clashes within the city. The second area is more distant fighting in fields and villages in the northwest and southwest, where Russian forces are trying to encircle Ukrainian soldiers. Petro, a tank operator in the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade, says the fighting in the northwest has slowed down with the arrival of new Russian reinforcements. Most of the tank crews note that the Russian defense was more than in the early stages of the war. Petro states that the war is increasingly becoming trench warfare. Still, tank operators say they are ready to break through Russian lines and look forward to the upcoming counterattack. While Kiev tank operators and troops wait for the moment to start the counterattack, Russia is increasing its measures, struggling with the shortage of military personnel and ammunition. The Russian army took a heavy blow with the latest offensive operations. Ukrainian armed forces defeat Russian troops on the front line. However, the problems experienced by the Russian army are not limited to rival attacks. The Russian army is also experiencing fractures within itself. Bad news continues to come from the Wagner troops fighting alongside the Russian army on the Eastern Front. Prigozhin, who is also known as the chef of the Kremlin, published a video about the ammunition problem they experienced in the war in Ukraine on the social media account of his company called Concord. Prigozhin showed the bodies of recently deceased Wagner warriors in a video released at night. The Wagner leader stated that these warriors were the children of some and their fathers. The Wagner boss noted that his fighters were killed for lack of ammunition. He stated that those who do not provide ammunition will burn in hell. Prigozhin took things forward, announcing his plans to withdraw from the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut. However, Ukraine said the fighters had reinforced their positions to seize the city before Russia celebrated the World War II Victory Day next week. In the video accompanying a written announcement of withdrawal addressed to military leaders, including President Vladimir Putin, Prigozhin reported that his troops would not suffer unnecessary and unjustified casualties in Bakhmut without ammunition. If you don't want to give the Russian people the victory of taking Bakhmut because of your little jealousy, that's your problem, he added in the video. The state-owned RIA News agency later reported that Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu had instructed one of his deputy ministers to provide the troops with all the weapons they need. It remains unclear whether Prigozhin, who often makes impulsive comments, will continue to withdraw if his men do get more ammunition. In addition, Ukraine accused Russia of attacking the besieged city of Bakhmut with phosphorus ammunition. Ukraine's defense ministry reported that Russia targeted the empty areas of Bakhmut with incendiary ammunition in drone footage released by the Ukrainian military. Bakhmut is seen in flames as rains that look like white phosphorus fall on the city. Other videos posted on social media showed raging fires on the ground and white clouds lighting up the night sky. Analysis of the video released by the Defense Ministry confirms that the footage is just west of Bakhmut city center and near a children's hospital. White phosphorus weapons are not prohibited, but their use in civilian areas is considered a war crime. White phosphorus is a wax-like substance that burns at 800 Celsius and ignites when it comes into contact with oxygen, forming bright clouds of smoke. They create rapidly spreading fires that are very difficult to extinguish. Russia has been accused of using white phosphorus in Ukraine at the beginning of the war, including during the siege of Mariupol. Moscow has never openly admitted to using the substance. Meanwhile, along the northern flank of the Ukrainian-controlled area on the outskirts of Bakhmut city, tank crews from the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade are waiting for the ground to dry before they can start a counterattack. Tank operators continue to support Ukrainian infantrymen and provide covert fire from afar during battles. but muddy roads and heavy spring rains brought on by molten ground have left them to play a lesser role. It seems that Ukraine wants to eliminate key areas for Russian forces before launching a counterattack. The destruction of important roads and supply lines, one by the Kiev troops, will weaken the Russian army. The weakened Russian troops are expected to deal the finishing blow in the summer offensives of Kiev. There is bad news in the face of the overwhelming attacks from every direction. And because Ukrainian flanks have been compromised, the Ukrainians made a decision to retreat from the central part of Solidarity in order to escape the imminent encirclement. However, the retreat process was extremely difficult. The Ukrainians faced a lot of complications, and here is why. Last time I told you that the Russians managed to develop their attack in the central part of Solidarity, which forced the Ukrainians to step back from the salt mines in order to avoid the salient. From that point on, the situation was as follows: the Ukrainians were controlling the salt mine entrances and high-rise buildings, while the Russians were controlling the Artem-Sol area, central part, and northern outskirts. But the most important developments were happening around the city. Here, the Russians had increased their control significantly, creating a pocket around Solidarity. I told you that that night should have been decisive and that the Ukrainians should either conduct a counterattack and clear the flanks or retreat. Today, it became clear that the Ukrainians had decided to retreat. Unfortunately, the situation was developing so quickly that the retreat process did not go smoothly. The Russians had already assumed positions in the central part of the city, so retreating from the high-rise buildings became very difficult. On top of that, the Russians continued pushing from the north. The Ukrainians had no chance but to leave some forces as rear guards in order to ensure that most troops were able to retreat. Russian sources at first reported that they managed to encircle around 500 Ukrainians. However, later, only 100 soldiers have reportedly been captured. Nonetheless, the fighting in the area has not slowed down at all. It just shifted westward. Today in the morning, geolocated footage of fights show that the fights were taking place near the next industrial area on the line. Prior to that, the Wagners had already shared footage of captured salt mines in the center of the city. Prigozhin was present during the capture of Solidarity, which made an impression, to be honest. All Russian commanders who had been close to the front line were killed at the beginning of the war. So for the last half a year, all high-level Russian commanders have always preferred safety. So the presence of Prigozhin inside the city that is still being stormed is quite unusual. The Russians are also reportedly storming Ilsc station, so I do not expect the Ukrainians to hold the second salt mine area for long. When it comes to the third salt mine, the Wagners are not yet developing their offensive in this direction. Now let's zoom out to see the situation around Soldau. Russian sources reported that even though they established fire control over the settlements to the north and south of Solidarity, the offensive operation in this direction is not being developed yet. The main goal all along has been fixing Ukrainian troops and not allowing them to send reinforcements to Soldau. For example, according to Russian sources, by getting close to Blahodatn, they managed to prevent the relocation of several battalions. This is not unlikely as the Russians are controlling the local heights and almost all the roads in the region are located in the lowlands. The main obstacles for the Russians in the Solidar area at the moment are the northern, western, and southwestern suburbs, in particular Paraskeva, Krasnaya, Gora, Blahodatn, Seal, Krasnopolsky, and Vasily. The good news is that all sources confirm that apart from the rear guards, the Ukrainians have withdrawn all forces and equipment. Some sources indicate that most units have already been relocated to Siversk. Other sources informed that Ukrainian units that left the city have been dispersed in the surrounding settlements, which makes more sense. Most of the surrounding settlements are not stormed yet after establishing control over Horodnia. The only settlement under Russian fire is Krasnohorivka. Overall, some of the best defensive positions in Ukraine have essentially been rendered useless because the Ukrainians could not protect their flanks as the Russians established total control over the high ground around Soledar. The Russians were able to attack the defensive positions from every direction and significantly complicate the plan support. The battle for Soledar once again emphasized how critical it is to control the high ground, even in modern warfare. Critical health corridors, right, came from Ukraine. The Russian army was at a loss what to do in Donetsk. The ingenious operation of Ukrainian soldiers in this region drove Putin crazy. Then Putin's threats against the countries supporting Ukraine stunned everyone. But the US response to these threats resonated all over the world. In the last days of the Russian-Ukrainian war, one bombshell after another came. The Russian army has accomplished a huge disgrace in the Ukrainian region. This outstanding success of the Ukrainian soldiers will completely change the course of the war. This operation, which is the result of the support the Ukrainian army has received recently, was very important. It became clear that Russia had decided to pursue a different strategy in the regions where it attempted to invade. This strategy was to deal a solid blow to the Ukrainian army. Russians with high combat experience against Ukrainian soldiers, especially if they were pro-Putin, were quickly promoted in rank and became headquarters commanders. One of these Russian soldiers incurred the wrath of the Ukrainian army. Russia was literally cornered to beat this. Thanks to its developing intelligence, Ukraine has started to identify all Russian headquarters in this region. The equipment used to identify these headquarters has been provided to Ukraine with aid since the beginning of the war. But thanks to this latest training, every step Russia takes and all its headquarters in the region can now be detected thanks to this detection. Ukrainian soldiers have carried out one major operation after another against the Russian army. But thanks to this last operation, Putin was dealt a very heavy blow. The Ukrainian army first started to collect intelligence specifically for the headquarters where they planned to organize an operation. This operation to be organized in Donetsk, which has been in the hands of Russia for a while, was very critical in terms of regional dominance. Russia's doubts that we had already occupied Donetsk made the operation even easier. When the Ukrainian army contacted its agents inside the Russian army, it learned that there were not enough security measures. And most of these headquarters, the most important reason for this was Russia's complacency in the occupied territories. This was one of the major problems that the Russian army faced from the very beginning of the war. Ukraine has managed to turn this problem in its favor. Every time in this operation, the Ukrainian army also decided to deploy critical weapons. The Russian army, which had attacked Bakhmut intensively, had directed all the means at its disposal to this region. But thanks to this surprise attack by Ukraine, the Russian army suffered a very heavy defeat. The details of the operation shocked the whole world. The Ukrainian army first started to determine the equipment it would use in the attack on this region. At this point, one of the internal intelligence was that there was no air defense system protecting this headquarters in Donetsk. This led the Ukrainian army to bring out the Bayraktars, which it has been actively using since the beginning of the war. In addition to the Bayraktars, the Ukrainian army also mobilized HIMARS. This once again showed everyone how big an operation the Ukrainian troops were going to organize. The Ukrainian army, first of all, deployed Ukrainian special forces in this operation. When the Ukrainian special forces arrived in this area, the Russian soldiers were cornered. Knowing how critical the operation was, this group mobilized the Ukrainian army, which blockaded the corridors during the watch. Change of the observation units first called for surrender. The Ukrainian army was vastly outnumbered. The Russians were surprised by the call to surrender, but immediately afterwards, not knowing the number of the Ukrainian army, they went for their weapons. Russian soldiers who could not understand where to deploy in the clash suffered heavy damage. But when the persistently refused to surrender, HIMARS came into play. First, HIMARS missiles began to fall one after another on the Russian military headquarters. After that, Russian soldiers panicked and tried to communicate with the Kremlin. But the Ukrainian army had activated jammers in that area. Unable to call for support, some of the Russian soldiers began to flee. This caused panic among many soldiers on the front line. In successive attacks, Ukrainian soldiers neutralized the headquarters commander. The Ukrainian army then took advantage of the panic and once again called for surrender. The Russian army decided to surrender with the loss of the commander's life. This operation was recorded as the biggest operation of the Ukrainian army in Donetsk. The Ukrainian army has recently begun to deliver one serious blow after another. Thanks to these blows, Ukrainian soldiers have cornered Russia badly. It is not yet known what Russia will do, especially because of the rank and file soldiers who have lost their lives recently. If the situation continues like this, there will be no commander left to lead the Russian army. Russia will again pay the price for Putin's rapid expenditure of troops. Putin is one of the biggest reasons why Russia is in such a failed period in terms of war. The reason for this issue, which the whole world is wondering about, is again related to Putin's evil plan. The fact that the Russian army was so firmly cornered stunned the whole world. It has once again been revealed how bad the Russian army, which is known as the second most powerful army in the world, is in a bad state. During the Soviet Union, Russia was even considered the most powerful army in the world. But everything changed after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the establishment of the Putin regime. For a long time, Putin has been having great difficulties in governing the country, thinking that the army might stage a coup because of these problems. Putin has started to take constant measures against this. One of these measures was to dismiss successful generals in the army who could be associated with coups. These were generals who could have been very successful against the Ukrainian army, but Putin forcibly retired each and every one of them. Finally, it was Sergei Surovikin's turn. Sergei Surovikin was a former commander of the Ukrainian front, but because Putin had discarded anyone who might have been a rival, he chose to put Russia in a bad situation rather than succeed in Ukraine. Surovikin's most important characteristic was that he had serious battlefield experience. But what really scared Putin was Surovikin's intense relations with Prigozhin. If Prigozhin, whom he saw as an alternative to himself, came to power, Putin would be in a very difficult situation in response to this difficulty. Putin's fall from power was the beginning of a very big crisis because Putin had been in power for nearly 30 years. During this period, he had committed many crimes and war crimes for which he could be tried. And not only him, Putin's entire circle of bureaucrats would be considered responsible for these crimes and would be severely punished by international courts. Aware of this, Putin gained the power to cancel even the elections if he had the slightest doubt. He even decided to build a very strong army in case of popular uprisings and troubles. This army was in charge of protecting Putin's regime. This army, consisting of approximately 340,000 people, caused a lot of controversy. The fact that Putin, who continues on his way with an anti-democratic administration, took such a measure was actually an indication that he was afraid of falling from power in the near future. In response, for analysts, comments justified Putin's concerns. According to war analysts, Putin was about to face a very big problem. Russia is in its most difficult period for a long time. This period has put Russia into a huge crisis, especially in economic terms. If Putin's steps continue in this way, events will start to come to a much harsher point. And with this, Putin's power will come to an end this time.